And good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Saturday, August 19th, 2017 edition of Auto Talk. I am your host, Ed Welsh, and for the rest of this hour, we'll be discussing matters that are of pertinence to you and your automobile. As always, we hope to impart to you some useful automotive information and perhaps provoke some automotive conversation on this changing weather Saturday morning in the Mohawk Valley. Hope that things clear up today. I think we're going to have a nice day tomorrow, but get out today and hope things dry up a bit. We've got lots of stuff to talk about today, but first, I want to get to our car care tip of the week. And that's got to do with spark plugs, something we really don't talk about very often, and what the differences are between them, because like most things in today's automotive world, there's lots of choices out there. And of course, the good news is it's not something we have to deal with very much like we did in the old days. So let's talk about the old days for a minute, for those of us who remember them and lived through them and worked on cars back in the day. But I can remember, of course, when people had to tune up their cars quite often. And it was an annual event, and sometimes more than once a year, you had to change your spark plugs. And all of a sudden, here we are, 40 years later, we don't change spark plugs anymore. What happened? Well, let's talk about spark plugs and what has changed and why today is actually somewhat more difficult to figure out what to use. So if you're a person that's a do-it-yourselfer and you go into the store and you say, hey, I'm going to buy some spark plugs, you kind of look around and you say, wow, we have lots of varieties here. And you'd say, okay, well, what should I do? Well, the simple thing to remember is, the short answer, of course, is stick with the plugs recommended in the owner's manual. And of course, the manufacturer knows exactly what the engine needs and what the intended plug is for that vehicle. Now, for those of you who tinker a lot, you may have heard that hey, maybe I can go one step hotter or one step cooler on my spark plug range and gain some kind of performance advantage. Well, that might be sometimes the case in a certain modified engine. But if your car's bone stock, there's no reason to change the heat range of your spark plug because the manufacturer actually designed it to use something exactly what belonged in it. Or in other words, you don't know better than the engineers that built the car. So when we talk about the differences between spark plugs, which is really what I want to focus on, let's talk about two most important things to note about spark plugs. For those of you who work on cars, you probably already know this, but for the rest of us, hey, we're gonna share a little technology information here so you understand how a spark plug really works. Spark plug, if you think about what happens when the thing ignites, really what you want the spark to do is jump from the sharpest point on the center electrode of the spark plug to the sharpest point on the side electrode. So what happens is the spark literally goes from one edge of the bottom of the electrode to the top of the edge of the other electrode. So you want the plug to retain its sharp edge for as long as possible. Now, that is the reason why they use precious metals like platinum or iridium in spark plugs these days, because those metals are harder and have a higher melting temperature than nickel alloy electrodes, which are found in traditional old copper spark plugs. Secondly, the small diameter of the center electrode. If you look at an old spark plug, if you were to look at the electrode itself, let's say that electrode might be a 1/16 of an inch across. Today, the diameter of a center electrode might just be a couple of millimeters. So the smaller that electrode can be, the lower the voltage is needed to start the spark. So you want to keep those things in mind when you start reviewing the best spark plugs for your vehicle. But in most cases, you're going to see a choice of about 4 kinds of spark plugs on the market. And they'll be making from at least 3 different manufacturers, and there's others, but 3 major ones. But how do you know which one's the best one for your car? Also, we're going to talk for a few moments about the difference between a platinum spark plugs, copper spark plugs, and iridium spark plugs, because those are really the basic three types that are out there. There's some other ones out there, but these are the ones that pretty much cover 99.9% of the market. So let's start with the old copper spark plugs. Now, when we talk about copper spark plugs, that means it has a solid copper core in the middle of the spark plug. And of course, at the business end of the electrode of the spark plug, where the spark goes, you'll see a electrode that's made of nickel alloy. And that's the largest diameter of all spark plugs. Remember what I said earlier, that the smaller the diameter, the less voltage is required to initiate the spark. So obviously you want that spark to be initiated as quickly as possible in the combustion process to maximize the charge that's in the cylinder so it fires good. So why would we use a copper spark plug? Nickel alloy, of course, when we talk about what that electrode was made of, is softer than either platinum or iridium. So what you have is the sharp firing edge that I also spoke of earlier will wear out quicker. And I can remember the days where we actually filed the edge of the spark plug so to get the edge sharp again, then re-gap them. That's what we did back in the days where we had to change them or service the car every 6 months to a year. And that became a servicing thing that we did all the time. Well, the use for copper plugs today are really for older cars. They're the best for older, and this would be pre-1980s cars even, with low voltage distributor-based ignitions. You would never want to use a copper spark plug in a high energy distributorless ignition, which is known as DIS in the car business, or where you have a coil on plug ignition system, because those things fire so much electricity they'd wear out that spark plug before you know it. So what you want is again, the old style copper spark plugs. If you've got an old muscle car with an old type of ignition on it, that works out best. It also does a pretty good job on your lawnmower or your snowblower for that matter. Anything that's old, it's old style engines. The old copper spark plugs are just fine. So when you kind of get out of that mode, the next one's really a single platinum spark plug, which is really a step up from the copper plugs. And what that really means is it's styled like a copper spark plug, but there's got a platinum disc welded to the tip of the center electrode. And of course, since platinum is so much harder than nickel alloy, it holds a sharp edge for as many as 100,000 miles. On the compression stroke, the spark really shoots from the center of the electrode to the side of the electrode. And what happens is you really get a good spark with this. And of course, this is one of the reasons why these plugs don't have to get changed. Platinum spark plug was a great invention, but it also required a much hotter ignition to fire it. And that's why over the years you've seen ignition systems go from low voltage to very high voltage, because we have to fire that spark plug, which has a different metal in it than the old copper and nickel alloyed plugs. But I will tell you that the platinum plugs are the most common used in modern cars today. And then you've got the best kind around, and that is iridium spark plugs. And that sounds pretty exotic, doesn't it? Well, iridium is harder than platinum. And in most cases, an iridium spark plug lasts 25% longer than a comparable platinum plug. And because iridium is so costly, basically what happens is the manufacturers reduce the size of the electrode, the diameter of the electrode, to make it less surface area on it, so they don't have to spend as much money as they do on the other plugs. Or in other words, iridium is so expensive that they literally cut the size of that electrode down as small as humanly possible. The other thing is that when you have a very fine wire center electrode on an iridium plug, and it is very, very fine, you have basically a electrode that increases fire efficiency. To give you a sense of this, the electrode on an iridium spark plug is less than 0.5 millimeter in diameter. 0.5 millimeter. That's pretty tiny. Now, many car makers require iridium spark plugs or an iridium platinum combination spark plugs for these COP ignitions, which is the coil on plug wire ignition system. I remind you that if your owner's manual specifies iridium spark plugs, don't downgrade to a platinum plug or a double platinum spark plug or even a copper plug. They will not perform. Which I think is the base takeaway from this is if you have a newer car and you are going to service it yourself, what you really need to do is buy what belongs in the car. Platinum plugs are great. If they come with iridium plugs, those are the ones you want to get. I'll also tell you that over the years, some spark plug companies have tried different types of designs of the electrode. For example, if you think about how a spark plug works, as it ignites the air-fuel mixture in a cylinder, remember I said that the electrode, the spark jumps from one side of it, from the bottom to the top. In other words, it doesn't come from the center. So if you think of a round electrode in a spark plug, one side of it's going to be hotter than the other side of it, even though it's so tiny. Well, what's interesting is the colder side of the spark plug tends to quench the flame, while the other side is trying to ignite the flame. So some manufacturers actually cut a U or a V-shaped channel into the spark receiving surface side of the electrode. And of course, what that happens is it allows the flame to grow quicker in the spark plugs. There's a very famous spark plug called the split fire. And that was invented in the late 90s, and I actually had the inventor of the split fire. We interviewed him back then on the radio, and I tested those plugs for a lot of miles myself, and gave them a lot of feedback on what how they did. And in my old truck, they were actually better than what was available on the market in a regular spark plug. And of course, what some other people like to do is, when you want to get really technical, there are people who index spark plugs. In other words, when they screw them into the head, they use washers or spacers under the spark plug to make sure that they actually point the correct end of the spark plug at the valves. So there's all kinds of little things that happen. But for you and me that just drive the darn cars every day, all you really need to do is use the correct spark plug and basically never downgrade. So if your car comes with iridium plugs, they're expensive. Don't go to double platinum or a copper plug because I get a better deal on this. They will not work in your car. Conversely, if you have an old car, there's no reason to put an iridium spark plug in it. Your old ignition system is not going to fire that thing very well because it was designed at lower voltage and it uses copper and nickel. The last point I want to make about spark plugs: when you change your plugs, excuse me, if you do it yourself or have someone do it for you, one of the things that happen in today's world, the fact that they last so long, is they could be inside they could be screwed into the cylinder head and be there for years, because a lot of them last 80, 90, 100,000 miles today. Well, when you pull the plugs out, if you're going to put new ones in, I always use, and I recommend this, a little never seize on the threads of the plug. So when you screw them in and torque them in, they'll want to come out at some time in the future. The next guy that has to take them out will be very grateful that you had some never seize on the threads. Because boy, breaking off a spark plug or having it seized into the head is a nightmare for a mechanic to fix, or yourself.